Well, good afternoon, fellow YouTubers. I'm out again to film another project. This is going to be my 2004 Sienna, Toyota Sienna XLE van that the steering rack is basically toast. I'll be able to show you that once I get this vehicle jacked up and underneath. But I just wanted to welcome you to sunny North Carolina, where we've had snow and single-digit temperatures. I'm going to do this project in my garage, and it's going to be a bit of a tight fit. So again, I'll be doing this in increments. But unfortunately, the steering rack and one of the pressure hoses has gone bad, and I need to replace that because it failed inspection. So I'm going to go up to the engine compartment and show you what I'm going to do first. Okay, I'm hoping we have decent light for this. Now, we're looking at the reservoir for the power steering fluid. And unfortunately, right here at this clip and behind, I have a bit of a leak. I'm going to say a major leak now. Before it was just a seep. Now if you look, this hose goes all the way down to the fender well, takes a turn, and then goes up underneath the car. So I'm going to have to remove the apron in order to remove this entire pressure tube. Now, you would think that that piece of rubber hose would be the only thing I'd have to replace because it only goes 8 to 10 inches down. Nope, that's not the way it's made. You have to buy the entire setup from Toyota. Now, I got this part online at its OEM. I got this part online for about $75. It's normally $115 and up. I do go OEM in these circumstances, and I believe this is the only thing you can get with this particular pressure hose. I didn't want to attempt to use just a small piece of tubing and have it leak and lose steering ability, because this is my wife's car, and you know how that goes. She drives it, I fix it. Okay, here's what that pressure hose looks like. Again, it's all pre-formed, and again, I did not want to take a chance on anything failing, especially with my wife driving the car. So here is that part. Now I'm going to go to the other side and show you the steering rack. Okay, here is the steering rack. Again, I went OEM and I went new. I did get these parts from Toyota Scion Parts Direct.com. So the rack, brand new, I believe was about $526, and again $75 for the pressure tubing and hose. Then there was about $30 to $40 shipping. A significant savings over going up to the dealership counter. Now, I spoke to one mechanic. I do have a tendency to use justanswer.com, and spoke to a mechanic there. He says if you don't use the OEM, he's had good luck with a company called Maval, M-A-V-A-L, or Maval. Just depends on where you come from, how you say it. Maval. They're remanufactured. To save a little money, you could do that. And he says he's really had no problems with that particular company's products. Again, for the difference in price for me, and it wasn't that much, I want to say maybe $100, I went ahead and just got the new unit altogether. Before I attempt to jack this car up, I'm going to go ahead and drain all the fluid from the reservoir. Why? Well, once I jack this thing up, it's going to be tilted back a little bit, and it's going to be more difficult to get all the fluid out. Now, some people use turkey basters. Some people use a syringe with some rubber hose on the end. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a container right down in here. Well, how am I going to keep it from splashing all over the paint job? Because you know, this stuff will eat up the paint. Aluminum foil, or if you're British, aluminium. Take some aluminum foil, form its own funnel into the container, and when you're done, wrap it up and throw it away. I do that all the time on lawnmower engines, especially some of these engines on the riding lawnmowers. Oh my gosh, trying to get in there and keep it from spilling all over the engine is difficult. So I just make my own little funnel out of aluminum foil. So that's what I'm going to do first before I, like I say, jack this automobile up. Since I'm changing the fluid, the entire rack anyway, I'm going to put in new fluid altogether. And I want to say that was probably maybe another $20 at best. Okay, so I've disconnected that little hose, And if you notice, that's a very long stem. That's probably about 3 inches or so. It required a minimal effort, but you can see I've got it in the container, just a little bit splashed on the fender, but that's okay. I'll wipe that off, and I just went ahead and took the cap off so it would vent. I'll give it a little while to drain. And there's my aluminum foil. Okay, in the process of taking this tube out, on the fender, if you can see, there is that one particular bolt, 10mm head. And what I did do is take my ratcheting 10mm. You could probably do it with a standard, but it was just a little bit easier using a ratcheting 10mm. It is a very tight fit. Now luckily I got skinny fingers and skinny hands. I make good mechanic's hands because I can get in some tight spots. But you've got to take that out in order to get the tubing off the fender well, and then work your way down to take the tubing off down there where the apron is. Let me back this up a little, and you can see the rough location. Alrighty then, as you can see, I do have the car up on jack stands. I do urge safety. These are 3-ton jacks that I have, and I'm sorry, jack stands. I do have a 2.5-ton jack, and I do recommend that you never, ever use a jack to support the car when you're working underneath. That's dangerous and could be fatal. So I have put the car up on jack stands, one on this side. I've taken the wheels off. I wasn't going to show you that. I've got a nice impact wrench, 1/2 inch Ingersoll Rand impact wrench, and was able to remove the tires fairly easily. So let me swing over to the other side and show you what's there. Pretty much the same thing. You know, you always put your jack stands at the pinch point or the pinch weld where the jack is designed to go so that the car doesn't fall on you. Also, I want to take note, I'm in my garage. It is a bit of a tight fit, something you need to be aware of. Let me work to the back here. And you'll notice my bumper is very close to the garage door. You can see the bolt way down there. So you want to be careful that, when you jack up the car, it's going to tilt this car up and it's going to get a couple inches closer to the door. So I'm cutting it very, very close. Always be aware of that, or you're going to put a couple of holes in your bumper. Alright, so I'm up underneath the car right now, and it's cold down here. This is the passenger side boot, and you can tell that there's a lot of grease. And depending on which direction it's in, you'll see that the boot was torn fairly substantially. It's not a leak, it's toast. So, you don't really replace the inner tie rod. Don't know how long this has been leaking. All the experts say just replace the entire setup. So you can look at all the grease that is accumulated from all that fluid traveling from the boot and spinning its centrifugal force all over the bottom of the car. Alright, now I am looking from the passenger side fender well into the compartment. Now, forgive me, but I've taped one flashlight to the tie rod, and I figured I'd give you the best lighting, but let me show you here how things have just demolished. As you can see, it's a little hard to tell because I can't get enough light in there, but I can put my fingers inside and touch the inner tie rod there. So, needless to say, this has seen better days. At 184,000 miles, I kind of figure things to break. Upon visual inspection, this particular brace here that goes up to the McPherson strut, if you notice down toward the bottom, there's grease. So that seal has given way. That will need to be replaced. So I bought those from Rock Auto, and they're Beck Arnleys. I think they were like $27 a piece, not including shipping. I've also decided to go ahead and replace the outer tie rod ends. I mean, they look fairly decent. but I think I'm going to go ahead and replace those at the same time. Again, probably original, 184,000. They have seen better days. Now, I do have the steering wheel as straight as possible, and I am going to go ahead and loosen the tie rod nuts. You want to do those so that you can have the best access, I guess. And if you take the rack off and then you do that, it's a lot more difficult. So I'm going to go ahead and do loosen those. Probably use a little WD-40, well, not WD-40, some PB Blaster or something to cut through the rust. Let them soak a little bit, come back, liquid wrench, like I say, PB Blaster, and come back and loosen those up. Alright, well, back up top here for a second. I decided to go ahead and put the new pressure hose in before I started working on the rack underneath. Now, the problem that I had is that these air conditioning cooling lines are in the way, and I definitely don't want to damage those. And if you look right there, the mount that holds those pressure lines in has like a 10mm head bolt in it. I decided to undo that and pull it up a little bit in order to get this entire tubing out, because the tubing, is kind of convoluted. I figured that'd be the easiest way. But in order to see that bolt, the wiring harness clips on right here, right in there. And so there's a little pinch clamp in the back. It takes some finger effort or a screwdriver to pinch that together to get the wiring harness out of the way to see that bolt. Took the bolt out, loosened it up. Oh, by the way, I found another bolt, 10mm head bolt that holds this pressure line in way down here, right down there. You can see my finger on the fender again. It's out of sight, really, and it's just across from the alternator belt. So found an additional bolt there, and I'm going to go ahead and put the new line back in. Okay, well, I've hit a couple of snags, nothing major. It's cold in this garage, so I had to run the kerosene heater. But the one bolt that held that high pressure line in, that was very close to the alternator, I dropped it. I can't find it. I'll probably find it. Okay, before I so rudely interrupted by my compressor, I was saying I lost that one particular bolt somewhere here in the garage on that high pressure tubing. I'll locate it and put it in sometime later. Oh, also understand when you take those lines apart, it's messy. Make sure you have a catch pan or a drip pan someplace. So I started working over here on this particular tie rod end, and the passenger side, the set nut came off very easily, and all you want to do is loosen it, because you're going to have to count the number of valleys or threads when you put things back together. But this one on this driver's side is a bear. I just can't get enough leverage to get in here and actually hold the tie rod end and then undo the set bolt. So I'm going to have to take this off, and regrettably, but that's how it happens. This is when I wish I had a lift. I just can't get underneath far enough to get that done. I'll just take it apart once I get the steering rack out. I've gone ahead and taken the cotter pin out of the castle nut, and I usually use side cutters. Works very well. And I'm now going to go ahead and take my impact wrench and take the castle nut off. It's a 17mm in this case. Oh, the two wrenches that I used on the flat part of the tie rod end and the steering rack were like a 22 on the nut and a 21 on the flat side of the actual rod here. Easy enough. Now, there are different methods for separating a tie rod end from here. Most people will take maybe a 5-pound engineer's hammer, and you want to hit right here on the arm. Not the tie rod itself, you'll damage the actual joint, but you're going to hit right here on the solid part. Some people will even put the castle nut back on, and just enough that you can barely see any threads, back it off a little bit, and then take a hammer and hammer that up. But then you run the risk of damaging the threads. Well, I prefer like the Pitman arm puller. I go to AutoZone as a rental tool, AutoZone Advance, O'Reilly's, and I have it pop it off. It's just much gentler. You can use a pickle fork, but a pickle fork has a tendency to tear up the boots. Alright, I hope you get a good view of this. Mind you, I'm kind of doing this backwards, but you can see how that long bolt will fit on top of the bolt for the tie rod in, and what it's going to do is the two edges grasp just below the belt, just below the boot, and it will push it through. These things are tapered, and it takes a little oomph, and sometimes it'll pop, but that's okay. These things are in tight. You want them to be in tight. So let me go ahead and turn this off for a second and go back and undo this. Okay, actually that didn't require that much effort. If you can see, now the tie rod will just pop right out. Oh, since you're dealing with a steering rack, don't forget, well, the first things you might want to do is secure the steering wheel. You want to make absolutely sure that it's in the most straight line possible. And I used my seat belt to run it through and secure it to the other side so it doesn't spin on you. When you get to the point where you have to start taking the steering rack out, you're going to have to undo the one bolt that holds it into place that you can adjust it. If that were to spin freely, you would do some very expensive damage to your supplemental restraint system. The horn, it's called the clock spring. You would damage those components. That's very expensive to repair. So make sure that your steering wheel is centered and secure. I've already done mine. I just didn't put it on the film, but that was one of the first things I did so I wouldn't forget. Okay, this is my second day. Had to give up last night. It was getting a little bit chilly and a bit late. And let's see, let's start off now. Comes the most difficult part, and that's getting underneath this vehicle to get all this stuff taken apart. Now, if you remember how I'd done the tie rod ends, this one, I even used a little bit of heat, and I still couldn't get this thing undone. I just don't have enough leverage. I can only get the car up so high on these jack stands. Boy, I tell you, one day I'm going to buy me a lift. I'm going to retire and buy a lift. It's really hard to get some leverage on some of these bolts. Luckily, this is the side that it's going to come through. This is the driver's side, and it'll pull through. So what I'm going to do is take it off. I may have to put it into my vise to get it off, but I'll try it again. I can take the passenger side off fairly easily. I'm an IPB blasted liquid wrench heat, and I just can't get the leverage, and I can't get a cheater bar on there. It's just not enough room. Now, if you remember this little strut that went here, I took those off on both sides because you're going to have to lift the bar, which is a little difficult to see right there. Let me see, let me get the flashlight. Okay, you can see the bar right along here. You're going to have to lift that up and above to get to that set of bolts. There's one there, and there's one on the back side where my wrench is. That's the actual bolts or mounting bolts that hold it in place. So what I did is I went ahead and lifted the bar on both sides. Now I've got to go underneath and take a couple of screws out. There are a couple of bushings, and there's 2 bolts per. And let me get up underneath and I'll show you what I had to do. This has not been pleasant. It's very difficult doing this on your back. Now again, I'm lying on my back looking up. There are 4 bolts. There's 2 here and 2 on the opposite side that hold the torsion bar in. And there's the torsion bar. Very difficult to get these things out, especially on this side, which is the driver's side. And, you know, they're on top. It's like a 12mm head bolt that's on top, not the bottom. So let me scoot back and I'll show you why it was so difficult. Now if you look right here, there's 1 bolt in front and 1 in the back here. And the problem is you have a pressure line there and a pressure line there. Now this pressure line runs to a pressure line behind this bar. I had to take it off here and then take it off up here on the steering rack. Why? In order to get to the other pressure line with my crow's foot, and I used a crow's foot line wrench. You don't ever want to strip those things. If you can see, you want to use a crow's wrench, not your standard wrench.
or what they call a line wrench or flare wrench. I just happen to have a crow's wrench that I could put on an extender. This is extremely tight space in here. So if you can see that nut, and oh, also had a surprise there. Was not expecting this. On the end of that fitting, on the bottom, there's an O-ring. Did not see that in the parts list, nor did they include it with the actual new OEM part. So I've got to inquire about that. So then, once I got that pressure hose off the top, which is rubber, comes down to the pressure hose here. There's also a little 10mm head bolt that keeps the pressure line in place. I had to loosen all that up so I could get in there and wedge my crow's foot on that lower fitting. That took a bit of oomph too, because again, you don't want to strip that. Definitely makes for a bad day. Now, understand, I'm on my back, and this gets very messy. This fluid continues to drain, and you need to put a lot of rags on. Oh, I also recommend, I wear glasses, and they're shatter resistant, but I recommend safety glasses, because when you start taking these bolts off and all this fluid coming out, you're going to get stuff in your eye, and you definitely don't want to do that. So I definitely advocate having some kind of safety glasses on. Oh, let me mention here, what I did is I used a 1/4 inch ratchet that has a flexible handle, and it was a 10mm socket, and I used a deep socket to get these bolts out. They're not screwed in very tightly. When I was looking at the sheet that comes from All Data, they're only torqued to like 12 foot-pounds. 12 foot-pounds is basically what you torque a spark plug to when it comes to Hondas and Toyotas. You don't torque them very much. So 12 to 18. Well, this one says 12. That's not very tight. It's just enough to hold it in. Okay. Let me see. Sorry. Lost it on the focus there. Alright, so now I'm looking from that driver's side again, and you can see that one nut there. Let me see if I can get a little bit closer. That's one of the nuts, and the bolt is on the opposite side. You can see it just to the left of the wrench. Right there. Shiny. That is a 19mm head on that side. The nut is 18mm. And what I had to do is I had to take a flexible joint, an extension, and use my impact wrench. I had to go from this side. Again, this is very difficult because you're up underneath the car. But you can't stick your head up in there far enough to see this stuff, so a lot of it's by feel. I tried PB blaster and a box end wrench and tried to undo it here. Didn't work. Had a cheater bar. Didn't work. It took an impact wrench on both sides. The problem is you can't get an impact wrench on this side because you're so close to the transmission. Now, essentially the same on the passenger side here. You can see the gold colored bolt there. 19. The nut on this side is the same. It's about 18. Had to get the impact wrench and go from the back side. Again, these are the mounting bolts. Now I've got to crawl back up under the car because now I have to separate the steering. Alright, before I separate the column, there's a rubber boot here, and you'll see that metal ring. There's 3 little clips that just kind of pop up, and then there's a little rubber gasket which is part of a boot, and I separated that, pulled it up a little bit. That gives me enough room to push things back when I start removing the steering rack. And don't forget, you want to make sure you've got this thing secure, because you don't want it to spin. If it does, that's a bad thing. Okay, you can see the steering shaft from here, and you see the gold bolt right there. That's the bolt that holds the steering rack to the steering column. That was a 12mm. Had to use some PB blaster on there, was able to get up under there with a 12mm box in. This is one of those times I wish I had the set of wrenches that had the extra long handles. Maybe I'll invest in that. Oops, sorry. Got out of focus there. Let's go back here. Sorry. Not paying attention. Okay. So this would help if, like say, you had a very long handle. Again, a very narrow space. Now what I'll do is at the bottom of that, I'm going to take a pry bar and push that up. And that way it will separate the two. Okay, now I'm on this passenger side. I took the outer tie rod off. I left the set nut in place, so I'll know roughly how many valleys or threads I want to count this to when I get ready to put things back together. Now, also when I took this tie rod off too, I got a little sunshine here. Let me see if I can show you. There's some grease leaking. Let me go here a little bit better. Finally some sunshine here. Okay. There's grease. So I had intended to replace these anyway since I'm here, but you can see some of the grease that's leaking. Okay, as I was getting ready to pull the rack out over here on this passenger side, I forgot this one little bolt right there. Here's a 12mm nut, and that line goes all the way over and connects with the rubber hose that I had to take apart near the steering column in order to get to the high pressure hose, which had the I had to use the line wrench on. So that goes all the way across and it's mounted here. So I had to take that bolt off, and now I'm working on pulling out the steering rack in and by itself. I double check, make sure there's nothing snagged, because I don't want to break another pressure line. Those things are expensive. Okay, just to show you, I have it most of the way out, just so you can see the tilt. Again, I'm on the driver's side, and you can see the tilt that it requires to get this out. Okay, a little further out, almost done, but you can see all the way in the back. Okay, got this monster out. Alright, so let's do it this way. If I'm driving, there's the driver's side. Here's the passenger side. And here is the damage. Yeah, I might say this needed replacing. Hence, it failed the North Carolina inspection. So, I may have to transfer a few pieces over, maybe a bracket or two. I need to check. I'm going to pull out the new one and compare it. Okay, it appears I'll have to do two things. Transfer over a bracket, which is here, and this fitting. It'll go there. That was where the other line went. I don't know if that has an O-ring. I'll have to check on that. I'll take it apart. And then I have to take off this tie rod. But things look the same. Identical. Koyo. No, I'm sorry. Koyo was the original. J-Tect is the new one, but it is OEM, different manufacturers. But things look pretty much the same. Alright, so let me remove that fitting. Okay, this fitting is going to be a, I believe, 17 millimeter. Yes, 17 millimeter. Now this is the crow's foot I was talking about. I bought these several years ago. Where'd I get those? Northern Tools. Don't remember how much I paid for them, but they came in very handy when I had to do the fuel filter on a 95 Accord. Trying to reach that lower nut on that required this and several extensions. Now there's a different style also. Now this is the line wrench. Notice how it grabs on 1, 2, 3, at least 4 sides. There are the standard type, which is like a standard open-end wrench. I find these work a lot better, and again, when you're having to deal with some of these lines,
you don't want to strip them. So I got this style. Glad I did. Good investment. Well, I got this out, and I'll be darned if it doesn't have an O-ring. Don't use the old ones. I guarantee it'll leak. So I'm going to go ahead and call the Toyota dealer tomorrow. Unfortunately, today's Sunday. I'm going to call the Toyota dealer tomorrow and see if I get some new O-rings. Unfortunately, they did not include them in the box. I searched just to make sure. Sometimes they put in one little plastic bag. But looks like I'm going to have to round up some O-rings. Going to put the project to a slight halt for today. Boy, the wife's not going to be happy. I also wanted to show you, this is one of the two mounting bolts I was talking about, difficult to get to. Look at the corrosion. Now, you might hear the woodpecker in the background here. What I'm going to do is, I've got a bench grinder with a wire wheel. I'm going to take that wire wheel and buff that down. Get rid of some of that corrosion. And it's not necessary, but I do have a tendency to put anti-seize compound on all this stuff, just in case I ever had to take it apart again. Hopefully, I shouldn't have to do that because this car has 184,000 miles. Buff that bad boy up. Nice and clean. Good clean threads. I love a bench grinder. Okay, while I've got a little break in the action here, I decided to go ahead and take the reservoir off and clean it too with some brake clean, and then I'll dry it out with some compressed air. But as you can see, this is what I've just cleaned on the inside, and this is what was in there. That was why it was so doggone difficult to see the fluid level. This stuff is very, very old, and surprised, as the mechanic online told me, surprised that the power steering pump didn't fail. As you can see, look at all the residue. So I'm going to clean this bad boy out, and I'll put that back in, and when I'm all done, fill it back up with the fluid. Okay, got it cleaned out as much as I could. There was a lot of residue in there, which could definitely make a pump fail. I think this will be alright. I think a new one discounts $124. And although it looks like you can just slide this out of the bracket from inside the car, you really can't because there's some clips there. So I elected to go ahead and just remove the two bolts. I believe there were 12 millimeter heads. I stand corrected. There are two 10 millimeter head bolts. One there, one down there. Okay, while I still have a little pause in the action here, I want to show you what the old fluid looked like. You think it looked pretty bad inside that reservoir. This is what it looks like after I emptied it. Now, it's pretty nasty. You can't even see through it. Actually, you can see my reflection. Pretty nasty. So, again, since I'm replacing the rack and that pressure tube, I'm replacing everything, cleaned out the reservoir, and will replace the fluid. Okay, so we're back after a couple of week break. No offense to the Canadians, but they sent us all this cold weather and some pretty severe snow. They call Canada the Great White North, which is great, but this is North Carolina. We do not call it the Great White North Carolina. Canadians, please take it back. Okay, so like I say, it's been several weeks, and what I've done, I did remove the rack, and I have taken off the set screws. I counted the threads. Now, as you're looking at this is as if I'm at the front of the car looking back, because you can see where the pressure lines, that's the return line, and the pressure line will connect underneath it, run back. So here's the new rack, and here's the old rack. So this is going to be the passenger side, and that's where the demolished boot was. When I removed the tie rod in, it was pretty easy to slide it through after I removed the two bolts that attach to the mount. That can be difficult. You need an extension and a wobble or a universal joint on the driver's side, I believe it was. It's really difficult doing that on your back, and it really helps if you've got a second person. One can actually hold the bolt, which is facing forward, while you take the impact hammer and undo this. And that's what it took. It took an impact wrench, an impact hammer to get this apart. It was so tight. Now, when I removed this, I went ahead and I took the tie rod end on the driver's side off and just left the screw. I left this, or the driver's side tie rod end, on. Really wasn't necessary. I mean, you can leave it off and reinstall it and put it on then, but I just elected to go ahead and put it back on. The set bolt was 11 threads on this side, counting from the boot toward the bolt. On this side, it was 10. So they're both fairly close. I went ahead and installed this nipple that came off of the old unit into the new unit. And as I said, I never did get an answer on the O-rings. The O-rings that are in here are not a Toyota part. There is no part number. It really doesn't even show you on the schematic. So the dealership was not much help. I went ahead and contacted the company that manufactured this, J-Tech, J-T-E-K-T. Sent them an email, I don't know, a little over a week ago, inquiring, how can I get these? What size are they? Can I buy them from them? Can I buy them someplace else? I never did get a response. And J-Tech is somewhere in the U.S. I just can't exactly remember where. So I never got a response there. I went to good old Napa, and I ended up getting nitrile, which is good against oil and most fluids. Nitrile O-rings, number 11s. And if you compare them, like I say, the new ones are a little bit fatter as compared to the original. But then you have to consider the originals have been compressed over time and have become a little bit on the brittle side. They didn't break, but they were not as flexible. They also had some hydraulic O-rings, but those O-rings were much more solid because I guess they handle a higher pressure. They had less flexibility, so I elected to go to the nitrile. That's the Beck Arnley tie rod end, again on the driver's side, and that's left, and then that's right. So I'm going to install this back in the car, and I'll put that tie rod in after I get it in. It's just so much easier because you have to go all the way across the car. Oh, one other thing I wanted to point out. You can tell just over time, again, 188,000 miles, this is stiffer. Don't forget to transfer over this bracket also. Alright, I did get the rack back in, and I think on second thought, if you see the stem up there, that's where the return tube is going to go. The return tube from the power steering fluid pump and so forth and so on. Leave that out. Go ahead and take it out, and don't put it back in until you put the rack in. I'll tell you why. Once I got this rack in, I had to tilt it forward, and that's toward the front of the car, forward, to gently work it in. Slides in pretty easily, but you just have to tilt it a little bit forward and just kind of nudge it in. Now, when I hooked up, you look at the black line there, I've just had the most unpleasant experience. The black line is the pressure line, and for some strange reason, it just didn't want to thread. It took me an hour to finally get this to thread. Now, these are threads that you do not want to strip, or you've made a very expensive mistake. You want to thread it by hand. So I finally got it done. I don't know why it pitched a fit, but it just didn't want to cooperate. So it was much easier to have the nipple removed. Go ahead, get that threaded in, tightened up, and I'll have to look at the sheet. It's minimal. It's not extremely tight, about like a spark plug, anywhere from like 12 to 18 foot-pounds. I'll look on the actual sheet and see what it says, but you want it firm. So I tighten that up. I will then put the rubber hose on my metal tube, which is buried up in here somewhere. There it is. Right there. If you can see it, it's kind of tough. Again, I'm lying on my back, sitting on my head. Right there. I've got it tucked up high. But I'll put the rubber tube, connect it to the nipple, connect it to the line, and then
That should be connected under here. There's also this little bracket right there. If you can see, right there where my flashlight's pointing. Then I'll put that back on. There's 2 rubber grommets to go around each of the 2 tubes to keep it from rattling. I'll put that bolt in. And I've got to tighten up the 2 mounting bolts. I'll let you know what that torque is too. I've got to look it up on the sheet. But I left those loose so that I could adjust things and manipulate these lines. So I'll tighten up those bolts, then I'll put this hose on to torque these particular areas down. But as I said, this is probably the most difficult part of it right here. Very, very difficult lying on your back. It's great if you have a lift, but since I don't, this is the most frustrating part. I have been playing with this for an hour on a cold concrete floor. It's only about 45 degrees here today.
Okay, I was correct. It was about 17 foot-pounds for the pressure line. Now I'm working on the mounting bolts here. And if you look right there, that's the nut. That's a 17 millimeter. And back over here, the shiny one in the back. Let's see if I can get a really good tight shot there. That one right there, that's a 19. That's the bolt. So the bolt comes from the back, pushes through to the front, and that's where the nut goes on. 19 millimeter. This is the passenger side. Now I'm going to go work on the driver's side. Okay, so there's the nut right over there. This is the driver's side. Again, that's 17 millimeter. And there's the bolt. You can see way back there, the shiny thing. Right there, that's a 19 millimeter. Everything's torqued on both sides to 52 foot-pounds. What I had to do, when I took this off, I used the 1/2 inch impact wrench and 1/2 inch socket. I had to get the 3/8 inch torque wrench in here. My 1/2 inch is so long and this car is not up far enough, I didn't have enough leverage. And so what I did is I set my 3/8 inch with a little modifier, you know, the 3/8 to 1/2 inch adapter, stuck it in there and torqued it down to 52. Okay, so I think I've got everything underneath secured, and now I'm working on these front stabilizers. This is the driver's side. They're interchangeable. And this is the driver's, the passenger side. This is the original. It was the driver's side that I believe the boot had torn, and you could see grease. I can see a little bit of grease here. So I've decided to go ahead and replace these. Now, nifty little trick, if you try and unbolt these and it starts to spin on you, if you look in there and on both ends, a number 6 Allen wrench. It'll take a beefy one, but a number 6 Allen wrench will fit in there, and you can hold it while you undo the bolt. Now, this will be into, let's see, this was, give me a second, let me get my orientation here. Okay, so here was the top, passenger side, that was the bottom, and that fits through the stabilizer bar. And if you don't know about the Allen wrench there, it is on the other side. I did have a little bit of trouble getting this bolt off. It's been rusted on there, and I had to use the number 6 to hold the post in position in order to get that bolt off. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and replace those. Okay, so here's a little tidbit I just learned. The OEM stabilizer links had 17 millimeter bolts. This one has 19. And as I started putting it back together, I've learned, go ahead and put the bottom link in first. It's 55 foot-pounds worth of torque. Well, I put the top one in first. I didn't have any maneuverability to get in here and put this bottom one in. So what I did is I took the top one out again. I put a 4x4 on top of the stabilizer bar and wedged it right there so that it wouldn't bend anything or hit the pulley. and moved over here and was able to get my torque wrench with a 19 millimeter socket way over there, and it was a short socket, not the long socket. Just be careful of your brake line. But I was able to get 55 pounds worth of torque on that. So put this little bad boy on first, then put the top one, and conversely put the bottom one on the other side at the same time before you put either of the top ones. Okay, back over here on this passenger side. I am now connected, and I went ahead and installed my tie rod in. I think I'll call it a day here, losing daylight. I'm tired, and I'll be back tomorrow to work on this. Whoops, before I sign off for the day, here's the grease, the boot. This was the driver's side, and definitely had a leak. It's failed. Alright, so now I have everything back together for the most part. Now what I'm going to do next, I'll work on tomorrow, is I've put the tie rod bolts in loosely. I'm going to put the tires on, use just a couple of the bolts to hold it on, a couple of nuts, and I'm going to check and see how straight they appear and pull them off if I have to make adjustments. But this way I can't get a good angle to see how the rotors look because I'm at the limit of my garage. So I will put the tires on and see how straight is, kind of straighten up the best I can, and then I can put the steering column on. Alright, so I'm back again here, took a little break, and I have put the outer tie rods back into the frame, put the capsule nuts on, torqued them down to 36 foot-pounds, put the cotter pins in. Now, the golden rule of thumb, when you torque it down to the 36 foot-pounds, I can guarantee almost every time that the hole is not going to align with one of the encapsulated parts of the nut. So what you do is you tighten it until you get the first available space in there to put the cotter pin in. You do not loosen. You always tighten. So, like in most cases, I had to tighten this, maybe, a 1/16 of a turn to get these things to line up. And I've tightened them up, put the cotter pin in, and now I'm going to work on the steering shaft. Now, since I drained this particular system of all the fluid, my guy Eric that I've been working with on JustAnswer.com told me to fill up the reservoir with the fluid and let it sit for 2 hours. If the fluid level drops any as it fills the system, go ahead and add more fluid. Now I'm going to stop for a second and go back up top. Alright, so if you see my reservoir, it hasn't dropped any in the 2 hours. What I will do next, I'm going to go ahead and clean off the rotors with a little brake clean, since I probably touched them with greasy hands. Go ahead and put my tires on. It's still up on jack stands. I am then going to connect the steering shaft back to the new steering rack. I will then, without any power, but tires off the ground, turn it 10 times side to side, again without the power, watching the actual fluid level. And I'll probably have to add fluid since it will be filling up the system. Then, with the tires still off the ground, I will then crank up the engine and turn it side to side about 30 times. And you'll probably see all kinds of air bubbles as this system displaces the air. So once I get this shaft reconnected, and I'm going to have either my daughter or my wife hold the steering wheel for me to keep it as straight as possible, I'll then start on that process. And by the way, this was Dexron 3, Dexron 4 automatic transmission fluid in this car. I ended up getting the Dexron, hold on a second. Here we go. Castrol Transmax Dexron 6. So it covers all the bases. Alright, that's coming up next. Okay, so I got up underneath the car and I did put the steering shaft back on. I had my wife hold it so that it wouldn't twist and put it back onto the shaft that comes out of the steering rack. That's a 12 millimeter bolt tighten that up firmly. I didn't bother torquing it, I just tightened it tight so it wouldn't slip. Went ahead and filled up the reservoir here all the way up to the top. Now, word of warning, it pays to have a second person helping you do this. Since I bled this system entirely, it's going to suck a lot of fluid all at once. It didn't really pull much fluid once I did it without the power on. The minute I turned the power on, of course, that activated the power steering pump, and I had this thing full to the top. It sucked it down to just below the lower mark there. I mean, just by cranking up the engine. So I immediately stopped, poured some more in, did it a second time. Again, it sucked it down there pretty quickly. I think it took about three and a half, maybe 4 times for it to get to a level where it's at now. And so what I'm going to do is I've left a little bit on the high side. I am going to go ahead and take it for a test drive. Don't forget to reattach the boot inside the passenger compartment. There's those little clips there. I'll do that. Wheels are pretty straight, and I'm going to take it for a little test drive. I looked underneath at those 2 areas I was concerned about, where those 2 O-rings were. I don't have any leaks. Yay. And I'll just keep checking this fluid. Now, you know, I turned this left and right about 40 times to get all the air out. It comes up as little micro bubbles. So I turned it about 40 times. Once to the right, once to the left, second time to the right, second time to the left, and had my wife watch the level the entire time. And she could add a little bit more each time if the level did drop. But like I say, beware. When you crank that power steering pump up, it immediately drops. So it does behoove you to have that second person here to say, stop. I'm also going to torque down my tires, and if I'm not mistaken, the tires on this are 76 foot-pounds. So I'm going to drop the vehicle and go ahead and torque those up and take it for a test drive. Okay, so I took it for a test drive, and to keep it straight, this is how much tilt I've got in the wheel. So I think that I've done a pretty good job, if only that much correction. And that'll be straightened out during the alignment that I'm going to have done next couple of days. I am going to have to take a little bit of fluid out of the reservoir. Even at hot, it's above the maximum hot line, but that's okay. A syringe and some tubing, I can take care of that. Helpful hint. If you work in a hospital like I do, and in my line of work, we have what they call Toomey syringes, T-O-O-M-E-Y. Notice the tip? See if I can get a good focus on that. There we go. Fits right in that reservoir, just perfect. Got it exactly to the line I wanted it to be. An extra 30 cc's, which if you're not in the metric system, is about 1 ounce. So now I'm at the proper mark.